Welcome to the next ethics lecture. Today we're going to talk about utilitarianism. And as you can see from the subtitle here, the tagline or the thing you should remember about utilitarianism is the greatest happiness for the greatest number. So where we have looked at natural law and that you used reason to determine what you should do with natural law, that was the focus, using logic. And divine command theory, what was right or wrong, was determined by whether or not it aligned with the divine will or not. And today for utilitarianism, the basic way of determining what is right or wrong will be whether the action performs the greatest happiness or the greatest amount of utility for the greatest number. So you can think greatest happiness for the greatest number as a way to remember utilitarianism. All right, I want to take you through a few thought experiments. We would elaborate in these in class, but I do think it's important that we go through them. So imagine that you had a very wealthy friend, someone like, perhaps Steve Jobs before he died. Let's suppose Steve Jobs. And you had been friends with him for a long time, and just before he ended up dying, you didn't know this, he asked you to fly out to his private island. He flew you out there, and you guys had a good time, and he kind of took you aside and said, listen, I'm dying, and I want you to do me a favor for me. I want you to promise me you'll do this one thing that I asked you to do. And of course you tell him, sure, you'll be glad to do it. He's been a good friend to you. So he gives you a briefcase with $2 million in it, and he says, this is for a baseball team, and we could pick any baseball team. So because I'm not a big baseball fan, we'll say it's I guess Tampa Bay, right? I guess Tampa Bay has a baseball team. So I've been such a big fan of Tampa Bay that they've been such a important part of my life. I really love them. So I want you to fly into Tampa and give this $2 million in cash to the owner of the team and let them have a better baseball team with this money. Okay, so you agree to do it. You get on the airplane after he's dead, he dies. You go to his funeral and all that stuff, and now you've got this briefcase of money you need to deliver. So you fly to Tampa, and as you get off in the Tampa airport, you see a sign saying that in some country there's a terrible famine that has happened, and they need $2 million to say, and if they get that $2 million within the next couple of days, they will be able to save 100,000 lives. They'll be able to get supplies in there and save 100,000 lives. And you're familiar with this charity, you know what's going on, and so, or you know about it, and you believe them, and so now you have a choice. Do you honor your promise and take $2 million to the Tampa Bay, I think it's Rays, the baseball club, and give it to them and honor the wishes of your dead friend, or do you give the $2 million to the charity and allow them to save 100,000 lives? So think about that for a moment. And the answer to that, if you're going to use utilitarianism, is going to be, well, which one of these is going to produce the most happiness? And so you would have to then calculate which one is going to produce the most happiness. Whether honoring your promise to your friend and giving the baseball team the money, or saving 100,000 people from dying, you'd have to calculate. And probably most of us say, well, it seems to be a pretty easy answer. Saving 100,000 lives, even if you break your promise, you're better off to save 100,000 lives. Okay, and that very well may be the case. We'll come back to that again a little bit later on. Let's look at another experiment here. Two people are on a lifeboat. You and another person are on a lifeboat, and you have some kind of an accident. You find yourself on the lifeboat, and you've been out on the sea for a day or so, and you happen to find a compartment you didn't know was on the lifeboat, and there's enough food in that compartment that if you calculate, you're able to calculate where you think you are, how long it'll take you to drift to a place where you'll probably be rescued. and you realize that the amount of food that's on that lifeboat is enough food for one of you to survive if they are the only person that eats it. Okay, so the question is, what do you do? Do you share the food and both expect to starve to death, or do you have one person not eat and the other person eat so that one of the two will survive? Okay, and so we might say, well, it's better to save one life than to save 0 lives. Okay, now what if one of those people was an inventor of a cure for cancer, and the other person was simply a common, regular, everyday person, a laborer? Who should be the one to survive? Would you make a determination between the life of the laborer or the life of the person who has the cure for cancer? And for this example, you have to assume that he knows the cure for cancer. His research was on the boat that went down, so it's lost for good, but he could recreate it with what he knows. So if he survives, cancer will be cured. If the other person survives, then the world will pretty much be the same as it is. So who should you choose to be the one who survives? And for the utilitarian, it would be pretty easy if the person who could cure cancer is more valuable than the simple laborer, so the laborer would need to survive. All right, the trolley problem. We've talked about the trolley problem before. And remember the trolley problem, you have a trolley running down the track, and you have the option to pull the lever or not to pull the lever, and the only thing that will do is if you pull the lever, it will change the trolley onto a side track and one person will die. And if you do not pull the lever, then the trolley will keep going the way it was going. Nothing else, nothing else you can do, and the trolley will kill 5 people on the tracks down the road. So your choice is pull the lever and cause the death of one person who would not have died, or do not pull the lever and allow 5 people who would have died, who are going to die unless you act, to die. So for utilitarianism, if we're trying to get the greatest happiness for the greatest number, then one person dying would be less suffering, less bad than 5 people dying. So you would pull the lever and cause the death of the one person and save the lives of the 5 people. So that seems pretty simple using utilitarianism. Now let's look at another example. You're a physician, and you've got 5 patients that all need organ transplants, and they all need a different organ. And these 5 patients, if they don't get that organ in the next 48 hours, they're going to die. So probably they're going to just die. But you're in your office, and you have one healthy patient. You have one patient that comes in, and he's completely healthy. In fact, he is compatible to give the needed organs to all 5 of these patients. So your question is, do you kill your one healthy patient to provide organs to save the lives of the 5 needy patients? Or do you treat the healthy patient just like you normally would and allow the 5 needy patients to die? If you're thinking about this, you may see the similarities to the trolley problem. It is the same problem as the trolley problem, but it's just dressed up in different clothes. And if your answer was pull the lever and kill the 5, or save the 5 and kill the 1 for the trolley problem, then to be consistent, your answer should be sacrifice the one healthy patient to save the 5 needy patients, because the examples or the thought experiments are virtually the same question. Do you sacrifice one person who would not have died to save the lives of 5 people who were going to die if you did not act? So those are some thought experiments. You're welcome to kind of sit around and think about them and pause and do that. Should have mentioned that before we got this far, but those are the thought experiments. Things, keep those in mind. This is how you would make some determinations with utilitarianism. Now, utilitarian ethics is a form of teleological ethics, which focuses on the result or the goal. Utilitarianism is consequentialist in that the consequences of the action are what matters. The end justifies the means. That is one of the major tenets that you're going to find, that what you are looking for is the outcome. Remember, when we talked about natural law, the end was never able to justify the means. You had to always look at the action, the means of causing the action, or the means of the actions you're taking, the means by which you get to an end, and that's what determined whether the action was right or wrong, not the end itself. For utilitarianism, it is the opposite. The end justifies the means. Now, the first time we see utilitarian thought is from Sophocles, from 444 before the Common Era. And we see it in the play Antigone. And in this play, Antigone is the niece of Creon, who is the king. And Antigone's brother is in rebellion against Creon. He ends up getting killed, and the king says that the funeral rites for those who had rebelled against him cannot happen. And so Antigone has a choice. Does she obey the king, or does she follow through with what the gods have said to do? And she decides to follow what the gods said to do. So she goes and does the funeral rites for her brother, which then puts her at odds with the king. Now, he declared that anybody who performed funeral rites for one of these rebels would be put to death. Now, he loves his niece, Antigone. He doesn't want her put to death. But we see in this discussion, or in this play, that he struggles with this. Can I allow my love for one person to potentially cause the destruction to the social fabric of the kingdom? So, do I risk society by not punishing her? And he determines that the greater good is that society and respect for authority and all of that be preserved, even though he doesn't want to kill his niece. And so he has her executed for the greater good. And we see that the idea of keeping the rule of law means she had to be executed, even though he didn't want that to happen, because if he would have allowed it to happen, then it would have undermined society. It would have been bad for society. So one is sacrificed for the good of others. Okay, and so that's the idea here. We see this in Greek thought. Some early the founding really utilitarian philosophers. We see Scottish utilitarianism with Hutcheson, Hume, and Smith, and you see their dates there. And then the English utilitarians are Bentham and Mill. You see their dates as well. And that's where we get more of the development there. But these are all utilitarian philosophers, and you don't have to know the specifics here. Just hopefully you will recognize and relate some of these names. And when you hear names like this, and we're talking about ethics, then I want you to remember and think utilitarianism. Okay, two main features of utilitarianism: the consequentialist principle and the utility principle. So, the consequentialist principle is that the rightness or wrongness of an action is determined by the goodness or badness of the result. So, the consequence is what determines good or bad there. So, you don't necessarily have to look at what the internal parts of the action are. You're looking at the outcome. The utility principle, on the other hand, is the idea that the only things that are good or bad are types of states of being. Okay, so pleasure, happiness, welfare, those kind of things are good, and the things that would be bad then would be suffering or pain or sadness. So those kind of things would be bad. So goodness is our states. Good. What is good are states, not necessarily actions. Okay, it's what's produced that is good or bad, not the action itself. Okay, so that's an idea you need to have a grasp on. So the consequentialist principle, that the consequence is what determines good or bad. Utility principle, the good or bad are only the states that obtain, whether they're happiness, pleasure, whatever. That's the two main features here. And so when we are trying to determine whether something is right or wrong, we have to have some way of figuring out how much good or utility comes from a particular action. So the beauty of the system is that if you can simply determine which action produces more, whether it's pleasure or utility. Utility is kind of the generic term that can be used. You might have people talk about things like the amount of pleasure that's produced, but that can sound a little hedonistic, and It can sound a little off-putting to people. So you might talk about happiness, but it kind of is hard to talk about happiness with some concepts because some things really happiness doesn't seem to really apply. So kind of a generic catch-all term would be utility, and that would be some kind of combination of happiness and benefit and lack of suffering or thriving and different things like that. So the generic term that's often used is simply utility. So the concept of hedonic calculus is where you would add up the pleasure or happiness from an action and then the pain and unhappiness produced by an action, and you'd compare the scores. And whichever action produces the most pleasure and the least pain, or the most utility and the least suffering, however you want to categorize these, and you'll have different utilitarians that will use different phrasings, then whichever action produces more good over bad, gives you the highest net utility, would be the action that is the morally right choice. So when we think about the trolley example, 5 families potentially would be suffering if you do not pull the lever from the death of a loved one. You'd have 5 people that are actually experiencing death, and then their families, consequently, that are suffering. And on the other track, if you pull the lever, only one person is going to die. And so only one person would suffer, and only one family would suffer. So it's pretty easy. 5 is more than 1. So you can determine that, right? It's kind of easy to do a calculation. But a lot of situations are very much more complex than that. So we'll see that it gets to be very, very confusing. But we will talk about hedonic calculus a little bit, perhaps in just a few moments, and we will kind of revisit our baseball example again. The other concept, though, that you have to have with this is negative responsibility. And this is the concept that we are responsible not only for the consequences of our actions, but also the consequences of our non-actions. So, if you remember back to natural law, you were at the lever. You were not responsible if you did not pull the lever. You had no culpability. You did not start the trolley going. You didn't tie the people to the tracks. Yes, you could choose to pull the lever and change the tracks and save their lives, so to speak. But if you did not choose that, you had not actually acted, so that you were not responsible for their deaths. So you may have been able to intervene, but you were not held culpable if you did not. With utilitarianism, however, since you are able to act, then you have a responsibility to act. So, for natural law, you were not allowed to pull the lever because pulling the lever would change the track and cause the death of someone who would not have died if you had not acted. But with utilitarianism, you must pull the lever because 5 is bigger than 1. And there would be more suffering if you did not act. So you have a responsibility for not only your positive actions, the things you actually do, but you also have a responsibility for the negative actions or the things that you did not do, but you could have done. So you need to keep that in mind when we talk about utilitarianism, that you are also responsible for what you don't do. Okay? Well, let's talk about moral choosing here, and hedonic calculus, this negative responsibility, and let's look at this example of our friend that was the very wealthy person that gave us money to give to the baseball team. Okay. Now, there's a couple of ways that we could look at this, and what I would encourage you to do is to kind of come up with a formula of determining how much utility would happen from this example. Now, you could follow, there are some utilitarians that have given formulas and given all these different criteria to look at. Okay, but we're going to kind of simplify this and just think, what is the value of giving $2 million to a baseball team? And we could figure that a $2 million gift of cash to a baseball team might improve the quality of the team by a small percentage. So you might say it may improve it 5% or 1% or 2%, doesn't really matter. And so the team would get a certain small percent better. $2 million in today's field or today's world is not going to be a major part of the budget of the team, so it won't make a huge difference, but it will make some difference. So you would then take however much you are estimating that this would improve the team, and then you could apply that to the amount of fans that the team has, and you could have some kind of calculation that would help you determine if the team improves by 1%, then how much happiness does that correspond, say, to the average fan's happiness? And you might say, there's a multiplier that for every 1% improvement in the team's quality, the fans get 10% happier. So you might say that there's a multiplier there. Maybe you'd have to figure this out. It would be very complicated to try to do, but you could potentially try to quantify these things, saying an additional $2 million makes the team this much better, and then their fans enjoy watching the games a certain percent more. Okay, and then you could figure there's however many millions of fans for this team, and you could determine the amount of utility that a baseball fan gets from watching their baseball team over the year, and whatever that number of utility is produced, you could increase it by that percentage of increase in the fans' enjoyment of the game. So all of this to say, and I know it's confusing, to say that if the money to the team makes the team better, and the team getting better makes the fans like it more, and there's a lot of those fans who have a little bit of increase in the like of their team, that could end up with a lot of units of utility or an increased happiness that could happen. Okay? So let's presume you could do a calculation like that, and it would be very complicated, and you would get some number out of that. And then you look at the other side of the equation. What about giving the money to save 100,000 lives? And you figure, well, these 100,000 lives, they're going to be in a country that is not as well adapted and not as wealthy as the United States. They're having problems with famine that's putting them at risk. So you would have to determine the value of the life of these 100,000 people and how much utility a life of a person in this particular set of circumstances is worth, and how long the money that is going to be used to help them survive the famine, how long will that help them live? Okay, is there going to need to be additional support in order that they can continue to live? So say this only helps them survive for a year, and then they might die again. So you might say, well, we're just going to figure out this value of their life for 1 year, and you could then say 100,000 people, and figuring out surviving for a certain amount of time would produce a certain quantity of utility. And again, this may sound complicated, or it may sound weird trying to quantify this, but this is what you would have to do. And then you could simply compare the quantity of utility produced by saving 100,000 lives and the quantity of utility produced by putting the money into the baseball team, and you would have an answer. And so let's just assume right now, because we'll come back to it later, that the utility that is produced by giving the money to the charity and saving 100,000 lives is twice as much as the utility that would be increased by giving the money to the baseball team. So let's say we had a calculation, and for 100,000 people's lives being saved, let's say that the utility, let's just say that it worked out to being 1 unit of utility per year is what we came up with. So it was 100,000 units of utility for giving the money to the charity, and the end of the calculation was 50,000 units of utility giving the money to the baseball team. And so 100,000 units of utility is greater than 50,000 units of utility. So the moral choice is to give the money to the baseball team, to the charity to save the lives of the people. That's how you would determine it. It's pretty easy, right? So your moral choice then would be to break your promise to your friend and give the money to the charity instead of honoring your promise and giving it to the baseball team, because you have the choice and you have the money and you determine where it goes. You're either going to honor your promise or you're going to save lives. In this case, the moral choice, based on our calculations, is to save lives. So that is the moral part. Now, you say, but I would be breaking a promise. But that's irrelevant for utilitarianism. It's the outcome. Promise keeping is fine so long as it is still the action that leads to the most utility. If you made the promise, but now it's better for you to break the promise to produce more utility, then the moral choice, according to utilitarianism, is to break the promise. Okay? Now, we have two types of utilitarianism that we're going to look at. The first is act utilitarianism, and this is a form of utilitarianism where each individual action is evaluated, and each individual action is, you have to determine if it is the right choice among the other options that you have available. So, for act utilitarianism, an action is right if and only if it results in as much good as any available alternative. Okay? So, we are only comparing two things right now. We're only comparing with our thought experiment on the baseball team and the charity. But you could do other things, right? You could say, I've got $2 million, I'm going to blow it on myself because that'll produce a lot of happiness for me, right? And then you could add up that happiness and figure out how many units of utility it would produce by you spending the $2 million. And maybe you figure out that, hey, it's 200,000 units of utility, so the moral thing is for me to spend the money on me. But there's other charities, and there's other teams, and there's all kinds of other things. So you would have to determine which action of the actions that you could take would be the one to produce the most utility. Now, because of the way that act utilitarianism is formulated, you have some people who have criticized it, that I have to consider every action, and then promise keeping and things are not really important because each individual action is what is determining whether something is right or wrong. Richard Brandt, you see his dates there, he criticized act utilitarianism, and the next two slides here we've got a quote from him. And so he was a utilitarian, but he wasn't an act utilitarian. And so he writes the following: utilitarianism, it implies, the it is utilitarianism, act utilitarianism, it implies that if you had employed a boy to mow your lawn and he has finished the job and asked for his pay, you should pay him what you promised only if you cannot find a better use for your money. It implies that when you bring home your monthly paycheck, you should use it to support your family and yourself only if it cannot be used more effectively to support the needs of others. It implies that if your father is ill and has no prospect of good in his life, and maintaining him is a strain on the energy, or a drain rather, and I'm sorry, it says grain, I need to fix that, on the energy and enjoyments of others, then if you can end his life without provoking any public scandal or setting a bad example, it is your positive duty to take matters into your own hand and bring his life to a close. So, for act utilitarianism, another utilitarian is critiquing it and saying, look, it's problematic because according to act utilitarianism, you are responsible to do whatever action brings forth the most utility. And so you hired this person to do the job, this boy, and he wants his money. You should pay him unless you can find something better to do with your money, something that produces more utility than honoring your promise to pay. When you bring home your paycheck, you should use it yourself to support yourself and your family unless it could be used more effectively somewhere else. In that case, you would be immoral if you chose to use your money that you earned to take care of yourself, and if you could have given it to someone who could have used it more effectively and produced more utility with that money. And if your father or your somebody that you care about and you're responsible for, if they are ill and they won't recover, and they're a drain on energy, resources, and enjoyments of others, then if you can take care of things and have them put down, then it's your positive duty, notice he says positive duty, to bring his life to a close. Because they're a drain on society, and society would be better off, more utility would be produced with them not there, with that person not there. So act utilitarianism can bring us to some very, very difficult situations. Okay? Very awkward situations. Now, I want you to think about yourself. Some of you probably have jobs. You have money in your bank account. Is your money producing the most good for society that it could produce when you use it to buy food for yourself? Could you use something else? Could you use it to do something different? Then according to act utilitarianism, if your answer is, well, it could be used more effectively than what I use it for, then you're immoral by not giving that money to where it could be used more effectively. Your time. Right now you're sitting and watching a video. Is there anything that you could do that would produce more good for the world than you sitting here watching this video in this class? If your answer is yes, then you are being immoral by watching the video. And so the criticisms of Brandt here apply to utilitarianism. And so promise keeping is not important, and your actions and provision for yourself are not important. What's important is that you do whatever it is that produces the most good, the most utility. Okay. Now we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a few moments, but that's act utilitarianism. So is there some other way we could look at utilitarianism? Because maybe we like the idea. Maybe you, along with the majority of the ethical community today, says, hey, I think utilitarianism is good. I think it's the way to go. Which utilitarianism is the most popular form of ethics in ethical circles. So, well, there is another type of utilitarianism, and it's called rule utilitarianism. So act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism are going to be the two types of utilitarianism. In act utilitarianism, you look at the action, each action, to determine right or wrong. With rule utilitarianism, however, we look not at each action, we look at a set of rules. So here's the definition of rule utilitarianism. An action is right if and only if it is required by a rule that is a member of a set of rules whose acceptance would lead to greater utility for society than any other available alternative. So the idea here is that conceptually there is a set of rules, I like to call them the best rules ever, that if everybody followed them, and if society followed them, we would have the maximum amount of utility possible. Okay? So, there might be rules that say you shouldn't steal. You know, don't steal. If everybody didn't steal, that's going to make everybody happier. Okay? There would be, who knows what those rules would be. Presumably, someone could come up with these rules, or philosophers or people could come up with these rules. But anyway, in rule utilitarianism, it's not the determination. You don't determine which action based on the amount of utility you do. You determine if this action is called for, demanded by a rule that's a set of these best rules ever. Okay? So, that right there, then the determination of right or wrong is not in the action or not as it relates to the amount of utility it produces. Whether the action is right or not is determined on whether or not it is called for by a set of these hypothetical rules, or this hypothetical set, rather, of rules that would lead to the greatest amount of utility for society than any other available alternative. Okay, so act utilitarianism is really kind of a pure form of utilitarianism where you look at the action. Rule utilitarianism is a form of utilitarianism that it requires that somebody produce a list of rules for you to follow, and that you have to look to these rules to follow them. And the way they got the rules was they determined that these are the best rules there could be, and if everybody follows them, we'll have the most happiness or most utility. Okay, so people can argue. You'd have arguments about what these rules are, who gets to determine what they are, how do we know that this rule, this set of rules is the best. So we're going to look at some problems with utilitarianism right now. And there are some problems. There are some real problems with utilitarianism. First of all, you have two variables. You're looking to produce the greatest happiness or the greatest amount of utility for the greatest number of people, right? So how do you make distinctions between small amounts of change for a lot of people versus large amount of change for a few? This is a problem. Okay, let's go back to our baseball example. Okay, we have got, let's say, millions and millions of fans of this baseball team. And you're talking about 100,000 people whose lives are being saved. Okay, so we hypothetically just suppose we did our calculations and we came up with 100,000 units of utility for saving the lives of the people and 50,000 units of utility for giving the money to the baseball team. But let's change our assumptions. If we were to do our calculations, and if that, say, that $2 million increased the quality of the team by 1%, and that 1% increased the fan experience by 10%, and so a 10% increase in the fan experience was 50,000 units, well, what if you had 3 times as many fans for this team as you do? If you only change the number of fans, that 1% increase now increases still the fans. Each fan is increased by 10%, but now there's 3 times as many fans, so instead of increasing their utility or their happiness by 50,000 units, it now increases it by 150,000 units. And so now you've got, if you give the money to the baseball team, it increases happiness by 150,000 units. If you save the lives, give it to the charity, it increases happiness by 100,000 units. So 150,000 is bigger than 100,000. So simply changing your variables over a large number of people, or instead of the number of fans that are bigger, suppose that instead of increasing the quality of the team by 1%, it actually increases it by 3%. Then you would get the same calculation. 3% or a 3% change would make a 30% change in the quality of the fan experience, which would then still equal 150,000 units of happiness, which is still bigger than 100,000. So it's hard to make distinctions between small amounts of change for a lot of people or large amounts of change for a few. In fact, you could use reasoning like this to justify sacrificing people or abusing people, right? If you had perhaps we had a viewership of 1 billion people, and somebody said, well, let's torture someone to death on live television because people would like to watch that. And you'd have one person that's being sacrificed and being tortured, and you'd have 1 billion people that are watching it and enjoying themselves, and you'd say, well, that's the right thing to do, that's the correct choice, because while each of these people may only get a very small fraction of happiness from watching this show, and this one person suffers a great deal, when you add up all of their happiness, it would be much larger than the suffering that it caused on one person. So that would be a problem. We can see this kind of behavior even with the Romans, where they would execute people or torture people or have the gladiator fights. There was suffering caused, but the crowds enjoyed it. So you could certainly justify saying, well, there was more happiness that came from the crowds than the suffering of the people in the Colosseum. And so then it was the right thing to do because we produced more happiness even though there was some suffering for those few people. So that's certainly a problem there. First of all, how do you determine that? And then, are we really wanting to say that sacrificing people, individuals, or torturing individuals is something that's going to be acceptable? I hope not. So that's a problem there. And then the next problem is comparative consequence. How can the utilitarian know all of the consequences of an action? So we are responsible, in act utilitarianism particularly, for the total change in, or the total amount of good or utility that's produced, and choosing whichever action produces the most. But how can we know? we might know a little bit, but certainly we are not able to know the results of every action and all of the results of that action. So if you're familiar with the concept of the butterfly effect, it actually refers to a science fiction novel where you had a time traveler that went back in time and accidentally crushed a butterfly, and when he came forth in the future, the world was very different than it was because of all the changes over time that did not happen because of his stepping on that one butterfly. There was a movie about a decade or more ago that talked about that too, and a guy was able to go to different points in his life and make different choices, and then he could kind of see what would happen based on those choices. And so these little, sometimes very inconsequential choices may have a big effect. Now, people talk about the butterfly effect today of, you might have a butterfly in one part of the world flaps its wings and causes a storm in another part. But the idea is that there are lots of unknown consequences for our behaviors. So how could we presume to know all of the things that would happen from one of our actions and then be able to determine which action is going to produce the most utility? So how can we know that? The only way that you could know which action is going to produce the most utility is to have omniscience, where you are all-knowing. But omniscience is not a quality that any human possesses. In fact, the only being that might possess omniscience would be God. So, we can't know all of the consequences for our actions. But for utilitarianism, there's a requirement that you have knowledge that is way beyond what anyone could have. So then we have to get into estimations and guesses and things like that. And is that really where we want to place all of our trust in there? So that's a criticism. The no rest objection is another problem with utilitarianism. One should always do what promotes the most utility. Is there anything that you could do right now that would provide more utility? I asked that question a few moments ago. Is there anything you could use with whatever money you have that would provide more utility? So could you do with 5 minutes less sleep to try to help someone else? Could you get up a couple hours early and go volunteer somewhere and try to reduce suffering? Could you do with less money or less food or whatever and give that to someone who would be able to do more good with it than you? And if the answer is yes to that, then you are not being moral in your actions if you were an act utilitarian. So you would not have any time to rest until you got to some point where you could do with no less rest or no less money. And then the other is the absurd implication objection. So suppose that there are two actions that produce the same amount of utility, and one involves lying and the other is truth-telling. Okay? And we did the calculations. Let's presume we have omniscience. We know exactly if you lie or you tell the truth, it produces the same amount of good. Now, it does it in different ways, but the end calculation is the same. For the utilitarian, we would have to conclude that the action that includes lying and the action that includes telling the truth are of equal moral status. Because the only thing that determines, or what determines right or wrong, is the amount of good that's produced. Okay? Lying or truth-telling are not inherently good things or bad things in and of themselves. It has to do with the amount of good that they produce. So when you only look at the consequence, you have these kinds of problems. A couple more objections. The integrity objection. So there's an example here of let's suppose that you're traveling, you're an explorer, and you're in some country, and you happen into a town as you're trying to make contact with people and stuff, and just as you get into the town, they've got 10 people lined up against the wall. They're about to, and they've got a firing squad, and they're about to shoot them. And they ask you, they say, "Whoa, who are you? What are you doing here?" And when they question you, they find out that you're an explorer, and so they think that you're a special person. And because of that, they say, "Well, look, the reason we're here is there's some people that were causing rebellion, and we've rounded up 10 people, kind of picked them at random to execute them, to tell people that they don't defy the government. But since you are here, we will count this as a special occasion, and we'll give you the honor to shoot one of them. And so if you shoot one person, you pick which one out of the 10, you execute them, and then we will let the rest of them go. And so if you're a utilitarian, you say the moral choice then is that you kill one person and save the other 9, right? But suppose that your moral principles are that you never want to kill anyone. You don't want to kill someone. So then your only option is going to be to refuse. But they tell you if you refuse, then there is no special occasion and 10 people will die. So the moral choice for you under utilitarianism is to actually violate your own integrity and kill someone to save the other 9 lives. So you have to if you have to violate your integrity and what you believe to be right, then perhaps there's a problem with utilitarianism. Another objection is the justice objection. Small town rape and murder illustration, it's this. Suppose you're in a small town that has a lot of racially charged history. You've been the sheriff there for 20 years, and in your 20 years, you have done your best to get over the racism and the problems of hatred in the town, and you've made a lot of progress. The town's a lot better than it used to be. But somebody ends up brutally assaulted. They are raped and murdered, and so they're dead. And you have a good evidence of who the person that did this is. And if you arrest and charge this person, it's going to cause a bunch of strife and probably rioting and all kinds of problems, because it's going to be a very racially charged issue, and it's going to cause chaos, and it's going to make things just as bad as they were 20 years ago, or even worse. Okay? So that's the situation. You know who did it. Only you know this. You found the evidence. And you know that if you charge this person and bring justice the way you're supposed to, that it's going to ruin all of the work that you've done, and then people are going to be in just as bad a shape as before all of this work started. So it's going to have all the same hatreds and different things that you've been dealing with, and it's going to be worse than ever. But there's also this person in town who everybody hates. And you know that you could frame this person. You could let the guilty person go and blame this transient person that everybody hates. That person would have a quick, swift trial and would be executed, and there would be no racial problems, there would be no rioting, there would be nothing like that. So, as the sheriff in this town, what should you do? Well, if you add up the numbers and you say, well, if there's going to be riots and people are going to suffer because of this and all these hatred, then the amount of negative utility that would be produced is going to be high. And if we execute this one person, it's going to be bad for him, but it's going to save the town a lot of stuff. And so suppose you could do this, and the only person that would know what you did is actually the actual person who committed the crime. And they won't tell anybody, because that would be foolish for them. Then what should you do as the sheriff? Well, with utilitarianism, act utilitarianism particularly, would be the choice would be sacrifice the guy everybody hates to save the town from all of the rioting and problems that would happen from this bringing the genuine offender to justice. And again, that seems to be something that hopefully is very hard for us to swallow, but this kind of example shows you how a utilitarian would have to say the moral choice would be to frame the person who is innocent, because it would save so much bad from happening to the town. Okay? And then the final one is the publicity objection. Utilitarians usually don't advocate that everyone act like utilitarians because it takes a lot of work. The preference is to just have most people follow rules as a duty, which is deontology, which we'll look at next, while the real reasons remain hidden. So, the utilitarians often describe the things we ought to do, particularly if you're a rule utilitarian, then you just follow the rules. Now, supposedly someone made up those rules who would know what the best rules are. But they don't want you to act like utilitarians and try to figure out what is the best thing, because that's very complicated for all these other objections, too, that we would have. So they don't want people to act like utilitarians, but to act like deontologists or rule followers. And so the real reasons then still kind of are hidden in the shadows. And if you remember, Poyman says that moral duties must be public. So if you're not publicizing them, then that's a problem there. Okay, so that brings us to the conclusion of the utilitarianism lecture. I encourage you to ask questions in the discussion thread and to make sure you've worked on your assignments, and I'll see you in the next video.